Either way, it doesn't work.
Good evening, everyone. Anybody would like a copy of at least it's got the verses that we're going over. We will be on lesson 6 tonight. Absolutely. Anybody else? Lesson 6. We saw a portrait, part of the picture of the Word. What is God communicating? We saw part of that portrait last Sunday, the wedding at Cana, and what do we learn about God and how He responds to our needs. It's a very, very compelling study. I hope you got something out of that. Tonight is a different portrait. It's a different kind of look at Jesus and what God, who is God when you look at this picture. A couple of quotes. Any picture of Jesus without these accounts is incomplete. Should have wrote down a source for that. I don't have it. There's a reason for that, right? This is a portrait, a side of Jesus maybe we don't see that often. Any picture of Jesus without these accounts is incomplete. Dorothy Sayers, she was more of a novelist than a theologian, but she had this comment: those who killed Jesus never accused him of being boring. He was not boring or predictable. He was spontaneous and passionate. I fear that the church has worked to pare the claws of the Lion of Judah. Pretty interesting quote. What do we learn about Jesus? He was spontaneous and passionate. He was emotional. And we see part of that. I think, in the accounts that we'll talk about tonight. So before we get started, Trevor, do you mind to lead us in a word of prayer?
Let's pray. Our great and gracious and Father, Lord, we're thankful for this opportunity that we have to have you here in your house this evening, Lord. Open your book, study and learn about you, learn more about your word. Pray that you be with Brother Michael here this evening, Lord, as you bring your word into us, Lord. Pray that you help him bring out points, Lord, that we haven't thought about before, Lord. And others, pray that you will be with us, be guide, direct us, help us do more for each and every day. Pray to be with the other teachers here this evening, Lord, as they teach. Just pray that you help the service tonight be acceptable unto you. Be with us, lead, guide, direct us. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. So we are moving somewhat chronologically, and we won't strictly be chronological as we go through the study, but we've started somewhat chronologically, and immediately after the wedding at Cana that we talked about on Sunday, John in his narrative moves directly to this account in John chapter 2, verses 13 and following. And you see very similar accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's always 3 questions. Those who've been keeping up with the material, there's always 3 questions. But tonight we had a bonus question. And so the bonus question tonight is, how many events are described in these verses? If you look at John's account, Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, and I hope you had a chance to look at all of them, how many different events are truly being described here, and how do we know? Do we know?
At least 2.
So I gotta vote for at least 2. And so when you say at least 2, how would you separate it?
Well, the John 2.
Okay.
The one that occurred right after Jesus just starting his ministry.
Yeah.
And the other 3 seem to be, the triumphant entry. They're the last week of his life.
Yes. So there does seem to be a distinction in timeline. And that would be the most important distinction between these events. One thing that Karen noted last week that's probably worth talking about when we're talking about the Gospel of John is, remember, John most likely wrote his Gospel last, chronologically. And it's very likely that he knew or had access to what Matthew, Mark, and Luke had written. And I think you see that he wants to tell parts of the story that haven't yet been told. The wedding at Cana is not in any of the other Gospels. And it's very likely that this account that John is recording for us is not in any of the other Gospels. Again, John's trying to fill in some gaps or tell different parts of the story. They're very similar. And you could read what is in John 2 and what's in Mark 11, and you could certainly be accused of thinking that these are identical accounts. We're talking about the same thing because they seem very similar, don't they? What are the similarities?
Turns over the tables.
Okay.
And chase people out of the temple.
Yeah, so start with the simple stuff. Where does it happen? In both instances, it happens in the temple, on the Temple Mount, right? In both instances, he's turning over tables of the money changers. In both instances, he is driving. I think that word is used in multiple Gospels. He's driving people out of the area. It seems to be a very similar, and again, you could read through and think John must be talking about the same thing. Maybe John just got his accounts out of order. Maybe John made a mistake. Maybe all those years later, John was writing, he said, no, I remember this, and I think it happened early, but really it happened late. But there are a few small distinctions that are made. The first one is one Dad already noted, in that they seem to be placed in a very different time. John specifically, the other gospel writers also, but John specifically kind of keeps track of Jesus' ministry by Passovers, right? You know another year's passed when he hits another Passover. So if you go to John 2 and verse 13, John's very specific about the Passover of the Jews was at hand. And then you go on to John chapter 6 and verse 4, and John talks about a Passover of the Jews. And then you go to John chapter 11 and verse 55, and it talks about a Passover of the Jews. And so John kind of marks time with these Passovers. We know the passage of time. We get some sense of how long things are going on by John's keep track of Passover. And this is the first one. And John notes this right after the wedding at Cana. As Dad noted earlier, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, where do those accounts fall in the narrative of Jesus' life? Which Passover? The last one, right? The Passover that he ate the Last Supper with the disciples, like that Passover. That was the one that was at hand. And so they put this account of Jesus driving money changers out of the temple, cleansing the temple. They put that in the very last week of his life on earth. And John puts it in a very different place, in the very first week of, or early days, maybe not week, but in the first weeks of his kind of public ministry. So that's the biggest distinction. So either this is really two separate events, or John just got them out of whack. Is there anything else between John's accounts and the other three gospel accounts that seem to make them a little bit distinct? Anything you noted?
I think they said that Jesus will destroy the temple but raise it in 3 days. So
only in John's account, right? Only in John's account is that noted that Jesus says, destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. It's interesting, this is a sidebar comment, but when Jesus ultimately goes on trial, and we're going to do several lessons from now, when Jesus ultimately goes on trial, what's the charge that the Sanhedrin finally gets to stick? Blasphemy, and specifically what?
He claimed that he would destroy it.
He claimed he could destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days, yeah.
He didn't say that.
Yeah, so they twisted his words. But it is kind of interesting that if John has the chronology correct, they were referencing something that happened maybe 3 years earlier. Because John says that it was at this account, when Jesus cleansed the temple in the very early in his ministry, that he made that comment. And then he gets again, perhaps he said it many times. Maybe he said it later on in his ministry also. But that's ultimately the charge that he was brought to trial on much later in the narrative. So yes, that is unique, only in the book of John. Anything else distinct between John and the other synoptic or the other gospels that tell the story later in his life? What's that? A whip is only noted in John's gospel. If we are of the opinion, and I am, that we're talking about two different accounts, John records one that happens very early, Matthew, Mark, and Luke records one that happens very late. If there are two different accounts, John says in this early one, Jesus fashioned a whip of some kind. My understanding is weapons weren't allowed on the temple grounds, and so I think it says that he fashioned something like a whip in some versions. Making a whip or fashioning a whip. He found something laying around and made a whip out of it. That's only in John's account. What's that? Yeah, more animals listed in John's account. Are the animals that are specifically listed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Does anybody know? Doves or pigeons. That's the only animal, I think, correct me, I think that's the only animal that's mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What about in John? Yeah, there's sheep and oxen and doves. So that, again, maybe a small distinction. We're looking at two different accounts.
In the Synoptics, he is teaching and healing, and people are astonished at his authority. But in John, when it goes on, it talks about that he really doesn't say that much because he knows what's in the heart of man.
So the reaction, I think to Tara's point, the reaction is distinct. And this is one of the key reasons, not just timeline. I think timeline is the most important, but also the reaction that John gives versus the reaction that the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the reaction that Jesus seems to get in those Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as Tara notes, he leaves this cleansing of the temple and begins healing. And what does it say about the scribes and the Pharisees, or I think the priests and the scribes, right after this event?
They're afraid of him and they want to get rid of him.
They want to get rid of him. They want to kill him. And they're consistent about that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say after this account, this was, whether you want to say it was the last straw or whether this was just another straw on the camel's back, this was something that the priests and scribes say, we can't have this guy just running wild in the temple doing stuff like this. And it says they specifically says that they sought to kill him after this event. In John's account, what is the reaction? The reaction of those around in John's account, Jews, it says in verse 18. It doesn't even say necessarily that the priests got involved, but those around him said, what is the sign that you are doing? What sign do you show us for doing these things? How can you prove that you have the authority to act like this? It seems like they're more, I don't know if confused is the right word, but remember, Jesus is an obscure figure at this point, right? His public ministry, the public display of who he is very young. How many of these people have never heard of Jesus of Nazareth? Now, perhaps a story about some guy who made a bunch of wine in Cana, like you can see perhaps that has filtered down, and maybe that's why they asked for a sign. But what does Jesus teach? What does he believe? Who are his followers? I would have to think in John's account, he's relatively an unknown. So we're talking about a very different point in Jesus' life. By the time you get to the cleansing of the temple in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right at the end, they're very aware of who Jesus is. Like, this troublemaker is back. He's doing this again. But in John's account, again, it's just a different feel, the reaction. They're trying to understand what's going on. He's asked a few questions, and then it appears that he's kind of free to go. And I think that has to do with where we are in the narrative. They truly don't know who Jesus is at this point. Yes?
It's interesting to me that if the timelines are correct, like you said, that there's roughly a 3-year gap here.
Yes.
That they would, it sounds like, either Jesus didn't go every single time or that they stopped doing it, regardless of if they knew who he was, but then ended up doing it again later.
Yes. So, and I think to Tara's point, ask the question, well, why did Jesus do this twice? I think with what you just said, perhaps the answer is as simple as it needed to be done twice, right? Is he had affected some change, perhaps, but then by the time 3 years rolls around, all this activity is back and needs to be taken care of again.
But I think if they didn't know who he was at the time, it's amazing that they listened and stopped doing it at all.
So I wrote this down. I think that's a great point. Is Jesus is an unknown with a whip, just wandering around the temple grounds. How did he accomplish this? It's really fascinating. When I asked this question to Tara, she gave me the obvious answer, like, he's God. That's kind of the whole point of the whole class. He can accomplish it. Yes, I do understand that. But you think about an individual. How big is the Temple Mount area by now? It's huge. The area inside the outer wall, I forget how many soccer fields I read today, 20 or 25 soccer fields in area inside the outer wall. It's a huge area, and we're not sure how much of that Jesus really ran off or whatever, but one guy in a very crowded area with doubtlessly thousands of people. Anyway, just that part of it, when you think about it, is really strange. What's that?
How did he not get mobbed?
Yeah, how did he not get mugged? How did he get mobbed? How did the temple guards not come? And yeah, all of that. In his first account, I think that's interesting. And maybe it's because he was unknown. Did he have help from the disciples? There's no evidence of that. In fact, it kind of says they were kind of shocked about it, right? The zeal of the houses consumed him, is how they thought about it. So anyway, I do think that's an interesting part of the narrative.
I thought about that too, like it mentions all the livestock, and it was basically a farmer's market in John's account, and by the time the others report just the birds, so it's like, in my mind, I can conceive where like 3 years had gone by and this had started to kind of creep in again, and then by the time Matthew, Mark, and Luke write about it, would those people have been like at the first time they're like, what signs do you do to prove that you have this authority? And then in the other accounts, he's literally doing signs right at the same place and the same time as he's driving people out. And so, in my mind, that's what made it make sense that it was two separate. And what was he trying to teach those people who had heard him say, I'll destroy this temple and build it back in 3 days, and then giving them a chance to later at the end of his ministry, giving them, in his patience and loving kindness, and giving them another chance to make connections to the prophets and believe that he was who he said he was.
Definitely. There's lots of things Jesus did more than once. I don't think it should surprise us that he did this multiple times, that he gave them multiple opportunities. I don't think it's not at all unusual. He just did many things multiple times. One other thing about the narrative that is all consistent in it's the same. It's one of the things that makes all the accounts the same is when did this happen? We already talked about it, but what was going on? Passover of the Jews? And what did that mean regarding the crowd? Big. All-time high, right? There's no time, my understanding, read the histories, there's no time in life of a Jew in Jerusalem where Jerusalem is more crowded and more busy. Okay? So it's interesting Jesus takes that time to do this act. I heard it described as closing Walmart on Black Friday. It is the busiest time, and it's kind of when he shuts the show down. So I think that is interesting. One more question before we kind of get to other things that you noticed, and I think this is key to the narrative in all the accounts consistently, is so we've talked about when, and we've talked about, how. Tell me why. Why was this the thing that seemed to set Jesus off, so to speak? Why did this bother him so much? What was he doing and why did it bother him? Yes, sir.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, he's saying that it's a house of prayer.
Yes.
And John, he didn't say that.
Yes. And so it's another one of the distinctions that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all know specifically that Jesus made this quote about house of prayer, not a den of robbers. John, if it is a different account, it makes sense why you didn't note that. Yeah. So you've taken up what should be a house of prayer and you've made it a den of robbers. What does that mean? What does that have to do with what Jesus was doing here? What was going on? Set the scene for them.
Weren't they selling the sacrifices?
Selling the sacrifices, yeah. So again, we talked about doves and sheep and oxen. Why were those needing to be sold? Why you got to buy those at the temple?
Well, if you had people that traveled a great distance, the likelihood of them bringing their own animals, you had to be in Jerusalem on this day, no matter 5 miles, 5,000 miles.
That's right.
And you had to offer specific things. You bought them when you got there.
Yeah, imagine the inconvenience of having to bring the oxen or the sheep that you needed from hundreds of miles away. And so it's convenient to buy them there at the temple. Yes, ma'am.
Well, the big thing was the money changer.
Yes.
And what they did, they exchanged coins of currency for another. They had the people, the visitors didn't pay their taxes, but there were coins that were foreign coins, and it had the likeness of pagan emperors and that on them. So they would change those to the Jewish, and they'd make a profit on these changes.
Yes.
So
So the temple tax, and everybody that came to the temple had to pay the temple tax. The temple, the priest would certainly not allow Roman drachma or Greek denarii, if you've heard those terms. They were not going to allow the temple tax to be paid in these foreign currencies. They had to pay in the shekel. And again, if you lived outside of Jerusalem, you may not exchange shekels every day. That's not the currency that you live your life in day to day. And so you bring the money that you have, and at the temple you exchange it, just like you do if you go to a foreign country today. You go to exchange your currency for the local currency. You had to exchange your drachma for Jewish currency, for shekels. And as Judy said, this became not just a convenience, right? You'd hope it would just be a convenience. We want to help people who are coming to Jerusalem to worship. It became not a convenience, but commerce, right? It became lucrative business. The exchange rates, you can read some stuff on this, where they had got to, they'd gotten kind of ridiculous. The price of doves, if you buy them in the temple, it's like buying water at the airport. It's the only place in the world you can buy $9 water, because they know there's nowhere else for you to go. At the temple, the price of doves was outrageous. You can find some research on that. It's really, really fascinating about the economics of that. How much were some of these poor people really paying for doves and oxen, because it had become such a lucrative business there on the temple grounds. So that should give us some insight into why this bothered Jesus so much. So put all that together for me. Somebody help me articulate that. What's the problem with all this?
What did Christ represent? I mean, so he came, and one of the issues he kept having with Jesus the whole time, we whitewash tombs, they create all these man-made traditions, including taking the man-made traditions and actually making them, like you said, just completely corrupt of their traditions they made. Everything you just listed a second ago was things they came up with. Temple tax there, that's not anything God came up with. Temple, it was completely to lead to Jesus and how they were supposed to worship God in that temple, and how they were supposed to treat God in that temple. And he's coming not just to say, "You're my Father's house." He's leading something that's going to indicate how you were always supposed to be worshiping my God, and how this is going to be represented from now on.
Yes.
And you're completely misrepresenting what my Father had intended this temple to be.
Misrepresenting what my Father intends this temple to be is a great phrase. Yes, sir.
That brings up a point, I think, Mike, that what Ron's saying about misunderstanding of the temple and their whole mindset towards it and what they were doing. That's one of the interesting things here that supports the fact that there is two different occurrences. Because Jesus in his early ministry was just starting to try to get the Jewish people to think spiritually.
Yes.
And when he's talking there in John, he talks about, I don't know if you already mentioned this, he talks about rebuilding this temple
Yes.
in 3 days, and they didn't get that because it had already started. Herod had already started building it. And it took 46
46 years. that's a key point in John that's noted there is verse 21 and 22. When he was raised from the dead, the disciples remember what he had said and believed. Kind of makes you wonder how many of those little seeds Jesus planted along the way that didn't really sprout until years later. This is probably one of those. This one may have taken 3 years to germinate. It says it wasn't until after his resurrection that they kind of put that together. So anyway, very good stuff. So there's a zeal that Jesus has for the temple area, right? And this impure stuff is happening in the temple area. By the way, can you switch over to the picture? Is that possible? And I'm a long way from an expert. This is kind of a recreation of what the temple likely looked like in Jesus' day. And the kind of main inner part of the temple there in the center with the holy place, the most holy place, and the laver for washing and all that stuff there in the middle. The large kind of courtyard outside of that is called the Court of the Gentiles. Anybody want to take a stab? Why it's called the Court of the Gentiles?
That was as far as they could go.
As far as they could go. They could go there, but they could go no farther. There was a small fence around that center area, that part right in the middle. There was a small fence around that center area that was Jews only. But outside of that, Gentiles could go to the Temple Mount, and they could offer some sort of worship. Remember, the Ethiopian eunuch. That's what he was doing, right? He'd been to the temple to worship. The part on the left of screen, I think that is actually south directionally, but left of screen is a kind of a large, really, don't get a sense of here how large it is, a large porch area that Herod had built. And I think that in that area I read that it was normal for money changers to kind of do their thing under that porch, that's kind of what it was designed for, you know. There's a large entrance there, and that's where some money changing and some buying of pigeon things happen. On that left with the kind of the red roof. But because of the corruption, because of the size of the crowds of Passover, because of everything boiling in the city, that had spilled, apparently, this is what most scholars say about this account, this had spilled all the way into the Court of the Gentiles. It kind of spilled into what they would call the true temple area. And so, again, think about this as Jesus comes to Jerusalem to see this, that in this place that should be holy, this commerce, you can imagine, you know, cows mooing and sheep bleating and chains rattling and people negotiating. By the way, you don't think it was just a standard rate for a pigeon, right? Every one of those pigeons got negotiated over. So people haggling over the price of money changing or the price of the doves, all of that happening in the temple area. I think you get a sense of, like, it's a farmer's market, it's a bazaar, it's a whatever, it's an open market. There we're in this holy place. That appears to be what got Jesus' attention. One other thing about that I'll note is in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 11, Mark notes something that I think is especially relevant if you think about this happening in the court of the Gentiles. Again, where there may have been non-Jews, or certainly were non-Jews there in the court of the Gentiles. Mark notes in his account in verse 17, he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations?" And that is a more thorough quotation than Mark and Luke give. My house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations. That's pretty significant if you're standing in the court of the Gentiles where other nations can be present. So this is supposed to be a place where all nations can come and worship, and now we've turned it into what we've turned it into. That's Isaiah 56 for that quotation. Anything else? What else did you notice in the narrative that would be worthy for our discussion tonight?
2 or 3 of the accounts
Yes.
Jesus was teaching daily.
Yes, teaching daily, it's noted, I think, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think. He was teaching, even teaching after, to Tara's point, teaching and healing after. That was the point, right? That was the point. Anything else, kind of, for question one, struck you as significant?
The fulfillment of prophecies, you mentioned Isaiah 56, and then the quote in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is from Jeremiah, and a quote in
Also Zechariah, yeah.
the other gospel, John, is from Psalms, and so if, they had known the old law and prophets like they should have, they would have recognized this as a fulfilled prophecy, not just once or twice, but several times in just a short encounter or two.
All fulfilled prophecy. Jesus himself quoting from Isaiah and from Zechariah, John noting the quote from Psalms, all the fulfilled prophecy. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking along the lines of Tara too, just a lot of the different prophets and prophecies coming to mind. One of them was from Hosea, the end of chapter 5 and going on to 6. It reads, I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. It goes on to say, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. And verse 6 says, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. It's just like, just like Tara had said, there's so many places where he's trying to bring this home. And this word in Hosea is a love for us, despite the frustration. And you see kind of at the end of chapter 2 where he says, in 25, and I needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. And so I just feel like that.
Yeah,
That conflict of emotion and just.
that comment in John 2 is pretty unique. He did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people, and no one needed to bear witness about him, for he knew what was in man. It's an interesting, a very interesting point John makes at the end of chapter 2.
The other prophecy, did you say Zephaniah or Zechariah?
Zechariah, we're going to talk about that in just a minute, hopefully, Zechariah 14.
Also, I saw that when Jesus did to overturn the tables and stuff, the Jewish leaders didn't take him at that time because they knew the time was not right.
So Paul makes the point that, and I think Thomas mentioned this earlier, at no point did the Jewish leaders come and arrest him on sight. And that's a really interesting thing to think about. They certainly did so with Paul, when Paul caused an uprising around the temple. So was it that this was, at least for some of the people, a popular move? I think if they had at least considered that, was that did the common Jew understand how corrupt this had gotten? And when someone came to kind of take up for them against the elite who were taking advantage of them, it could have been that this was a more popular move than perhaps we think about. And is that why they were afraid to arrest him in any of these times? It's just a thought.
It made them look bad.
Yes. Again, there's certainly a lot of evidence that the priests were profiting from this. The chief priests were behind all this. In fact, you can find evidence they were renting space. They were subdividing and leasing rental space on the temple grounds so people could do this. Right? So they were definitely profiting from this. So was it perhaps more popular? There's only one animal, we mentioned this earlier, there's only one animal that's mentioned in all four Gospels during the cleansing of the temple. Does anybody know what it is? What's that? No? Pigeons or doves, depending on your translation. Any thought about why Matthew, Mark, and Luke specifically only mentioned that Jesus said, "Get these doves out of here. These doves are bothering me"? What was it about the selling of doves, perhaps? Anybody know? Who had to buy doves? The poorest. The poorest. If you go back, we won't have time to read it, but if you go back to like Leviticus 12, verses 6 to 10, it says, if you can't afford an ox, if you can't afford a sheep, and we're talking about the poorest of society, then offer doves for your offering. Mary and Joseph, you might recall, when Jesus was born, they offered doves. It gives us a hint into where they were socioeconomically. So, in the selling of doves, who's being taken advantage of? The poorest, right? The care that Jesus has for the most vulnerable, the care that God has for the most vulnerable, I think you see a little glimpse of that in the passage. Anything else?
I think it's interesting, Michael, that he also drove out the buyers.
Yes.
To me, that's the point of, it's not just that you're like it's not just like, the scalper, selling tickets right before the ball game kind of thing. Yeah, he's got a problem, but are you helping with that problem? Because, you're the guy that's, you're part of what's my point of causing this uncleanliness in the temple. It's not just because I'm saying it's an unruly trade of business. You're part of the entire issue that's going on here. You're representing why they need to sell stuff, and they know they're going to sell. I just thought that was interesting. Two of the accounts actually only mentioned the buyer. The other two mentioned just the seller.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, what perspective should we take on that? I think it's a really good point. Really interesting.
I kind of get the theme from the whole thing of just preventing,
Yes.
taking what is meant to be holy and making it common.
Yes.
And is it a sacrifice to me to take something that I own already, that's the best of my flock and the best of my herd or whatever, and to pick it out, take it on the journey and sacrifice it? Is that, to me, that's more of a true sacrifice than just, well, I'm just gonna go pay my money and get my bird or my sheep or whatever. You have no knowledge if that's the best, the firstborn or the one without blemish or whatever. It's living in a worship temple, and so just the whole idea of taking the whitewash seems like Ron said, like I'm gonna go do my act of worship, checked it off my list, didn't really put much thought and preparation into, like he said, the buyers. Am I preparing my sacrifice if I just go pay my money?
So is there some of that in what you said to the buyers? Why didn't you didn't come prepared here? And again, I think there's reasons why some needed this service, but Jesus does mention the buyers, and I think that's interesting. I will say, perhaps one of the reasons people didn't bring their own animals, again, you can see in secular histories, it was pretty common that the officials would look at your goat and say, "Nope, gotta buy our goat. Yours is not good enough." So you see the depth of corruption, which is another reason why this was such an issue. From what you read and what we can see in all of these accounts, how would you describe the emotions of Jesus during this ordeal? In all of them, I think they're similar. How would you describe Jesus' emotions, just from what we're given in the Gospels? Yes.
I don't know what other versions say in verse 15.
Are we in John 2?
Yes.
Okay.
He made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple.
Yes.
So up until this point, I had just thought he lost his temper. But he took time, if this translation is right.
Yeah.
He took time to make them.
Yes.
So it didn't calm him down anytime.
He made something. He took time to make something. Unclear what he made it of or how he did it. But yeah, he did take the time.
It wasn't like he was just already carrying around the nightstick.
Right. Correct.
Well, that makes the quote that you said he's spontaneous curious. So first of all, I like to think that I'm not spontaneous, so I wouldn't.
You don't want your Jesus to be spontaneous either. So,
But with all the fulfillment of prophecy and then the time that it took him to make the whip, and then, he was angry, but when you say like spontaneous, I would think of just like a random outburst. And it doesn't feel like there was a reason behind it. It was part of the plan of revealing himself as the Messiah. It was righteous anger, but it was that, which I wrote in the communique about God, he's a jealous God, and Jesus was God, and so it wasn't just like, this makes me really mad that you all have animals in here, but it was like, I'm jealous for your heart.
Very good point.
Even though he was upset, he was making a point.
I think that's important. Because both can be true, right? He was angry and making a point and teaching. Yes, ma'am.
I was in a class one time, and you know how it said, says that Jesus knew no sin and so on and so forth. And somebody, of course, used that as, their perception is that they use that to say that he did sin because he lost his temper. But I don't think he lost his temper at all. I think somebody down here was talking about he was very methodical in what he was doing, and it had to do with, and I think you said it had to do with how he felt about the people. So I said their hearts and the fact it wasn't just the worship, it was just how far they had gone. This wasn't even really probably worship anymore.
Right.
And they were even affecting the people. From if the entrance was there and going into the area where you worship and even inside for the Jews, they were, how could they really be focused on worship
Excellent.
God when all this foolishness is
If all that was happening in the foyer, could we walk in here and worship? Can you imagine? Right? Yeah, very excellent. Excellent. Yes, sir.
In my opinion, just looking at it from a parent standpoint, he was acting just like a parent would. We're all God's children. We're his children. And he was just, he got upset, but he was protecting his people. Just like I said earlier a while ago, looking after their hearts.
Yeah, you think of, I read a couple of things that mentioned that kind of parental exasperation. I think it's interesting. Yes.
Well, we know it's okay to get angry because in Ephesians 4:26 it says, "In your anger, do not sin."
Yes.
So that angry, there's a way to use that.
Yeah, it is, and again, this is a picture of God. Is God ever described as angry? Absolutely. We can find dozens of references of that sort. It's, again, not something we like to think about. But without this, I don't think without this picture, we don't get the full picture of what God was trying to reveal in Jesus. That's a very good point. Yes, ma'am.
Over and over, just kind of going off of what Tara said, Jesus and God speaking to the prophets over the years, showing that you can't be perfect the law yourself.
Yes.
You can't, none of them can. And then even what he's doing here, basically calling out the priests and all the things that are going on, right out there in front, laying it out there for them. It's just showing our need for a Savior over and over.
Well said.
And our need to be holy and set apart so we can have a relationship with God and have that avenue only through Christ and what he did and being that final sacrifice. I just think so many of his words that he spoke to the Pharisees and how he would just call out their heart right there on the spot, and so many people that were looked to as righteous. And you said before how like they came to him and just what it's flipped around from what you would think. Right?
Yes. He was good at that. Turning it on its head.
Exactly.
You have something?
I look at it too, especially from the third to the last question.
Yes.
He mentions accounts in my father's house. Jesus might have been acting in the room, but he was defending his father's honor.
No question.
His father's house, and for us,
Defending his father's honor, if you didn't hear Roger. I think that's a phrase we should have in mind. Yes.
for us, is that not still our obligation to defend?
No question.
He's our heavenly Father.
I'm going to end with this, and we didn't have time to get to the depth of this, but from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and chapter 6, what is the temple in the new covenant? It's his body, which means what? Church. Well, there's actually, Paul uses that reference two different ways. He refers to our body as the temple of the Holy Spirit in 1 chapter 6. He refers to us collectively as the temple of the Holy Spirit in chapter 3. if there's any place that Jesus is going to not allow, or what is going to infuriate God the most, where it's going to be impurity where? In the temple. I think we should think about that takeaway also. All good stuff, and we will talk about lesson 7, talk about Jesus and his interactions with children on Sunday.